Choosing a good caching plugin is super important for the success of your WordPress website. But now that you have chosen LiteSpeed, which is a really robust and good caching plugin, it's important to choose the best setting for it. And as you will see, it doesn't come with the best setting out of the box. So join me, Andrew, from More Convert, where we truly explore all of the settings offered by the LiteSpeed Cache plugin. Also, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more WordPress tips and tricks. So I'm just gonna install the LiteSpeed Cache plugin. So I bring my panel and plugins and add new for LiteSpeed Cache, and it's here. And now I have a fresh version of LiteSpeed Cache plugin. And if you have just installed LiteSpeed Cache plugin before and you have just played with the settings and changed some of the settings before, you don't need to worry. You can just open the toolbox section and click on import and export. And here we have a button, and you can just click on this button and click OK, but you have to just be aware that this option will just factory reset your plugin, so it will remove any modification that you have just done to the plugin. And here I have just a fresh version of this LiteSpeed Cache plugin, and this plugin has lots of settings, and in the version 2 all of the settings were in one section, but it has just changed its interface, and now we have different sections for different settings. So we have the dashboard, and we have the general section and cache section and different settings, and there are lots of settings, and of course we don't need to touch all of them. Lots of them are just okay as they are, and lots of them then just don't matter to your website. So maybe you are not using some of the features, or you don't need some of the settings, so we will just ignore them, and we will talk about important settings, things that matter most of the time. So here the first section is the dashboard, and the dashboard is using a service QUIC.cloud, which is a premium service. And basically what it does is that it's a CDN. It caches your website and then serves your website, and you can just get the statistics here. Because this is a premium service and you have to pay for it, we are not covering it here, and basically all of these boxes are related to this setting. So for example, if I just click on page load time, this is not showing the page load time for your website using the plugin. Instead, it's just getting the page load time from this service, and we don't need this, so you don't need to just worry about this page. You can just ignore these boxes here. And the second setting is the general section, and the first option here is automatically upgrade, and I just gonna leave it off. In most of the cases, I just leave updates off for any plugin, unless it's a security plugin. Maybe it's just protecting your website from attacks or vulnerabilities or anything related to that. But anything besides security plugins should be off, because they can just hurt your website. So maybe they can just break your website, and when you just find out that they have broken something, it's too late, and I just leave it as off. And here we have a domain key, and again it's just related to the premium servers. I talked about QUIC, and we don't need this domain key. And anything here just is related to the service. And we have notifications, and basically just showing some of the news and hot fixes and anything just that they think might gonna help you. But I'm just gonna leave it as off, because most of the time they're just wasting times and we don't need them. So I'm just gonna click save, and the only thing we changed here was this notification. But the second option here is the cache, and now we are in the cache section. And of course the first subsection here, and the first option here is enable cache, and we want this option to be on, because turning this option off will remove all of the caching functionalities and disable all of the caching functionalities of this plugin, and we don't want to do this. The second option here is cache logged in user, and basically what it is doing, it's a new option here, and the older version of this plugin didn't have this option. And what is it doing is that it's creating separate caches for logged in users, so every user will be served by a separate and private cache. And basically I don't think this is a good option, because if you are serving dynamic content and the user can change data or something dynamic, then this option will cause problems because they will get a cached version, and the cached version may be old, and they might get some problems. So maybe they buy something from you, but when they log in, they are not seeing the changes because they are being served a cached version. And I'm just gonna leave this option off. And the third option here is cache commenters, and basically we're gonna just leave it on. It's harmless most of the times, but if you are getting any problem with comments, especially with some comment plugins, then you can just leave it off. Just gonna let it be on. But if you notice any problem, you can just turn it off, but I'm just gonna leave it as on. This option here is the cache REST API option, and we're just gonna leave it on because it's really important that your REST API calls are being cached, and REST API is just a way for other services to access your website without actually loading it, so they can just use URLs. And most of the time by default you're not using REST APIs, but if you are doing, and if some plugin or something is just using REST APIs, then leaving it on will be really good for performance. And here we have cache login page, and basically it's just caching the login page, the page you use for logging into your WordPress account. I'm just gonna leave it off. Most of the time I don't think it's just doing any good for me, so I'm just gonna leave it off for any problem that might arise by caching the login page. And then we have cache favicon. We definitely want to cache our favicon, is totally fine. And also the next option here is cache PHP resources, and sometimes some plugins are using PHP files for generating some resources. So maybe they are not using static images, but rather they are generating the image every time using a PHP script. And generally these kind of plugins are not good for performance because they are very resource intensive and they are just using your resources, and caching these plugins is a good idea. So I'm just going to leave this option on. But if you just see some problems with your plugins, then you might want to regularly purge some caches, because maybe you change something and you're not seeing the changes, and that might be because of this option here. And cache mobiles is really an old option, and we don't need this anymore unless you're using AMP, for example, because if you're not using AMP, then any theme now is actually mobile friendly and is responsive by default. And what this option is doing is that just creating two separate caches, one for mobile and one for desktop, but themes don't work this way, and we don't need this option anymore. And also we don't want to touch this option here. It's just okay as it is. And we have private cache URLs, and we can specify some URLs to be cached privately. And if I just enter some URLs or use these marks here for some modification like exact matches, then these URLs will not be publicly cached. And by publicly mean being available to everyone. So that if a URL is publicly cached, like the front page of your website, then everyone will get the same cached version. But privately cached URLs like login pages or user pages are different for every user. We're just gonna leave it empty. We don't need this option here. And also we can force some URLs to be cached. So if a URL is not being cached by default, you can just force the plugin to cache that URL, and basically it's gonna ignore some URLs because they have some parameters in their string. So maybe a URL is just like this, my path / my page, and then it has AA equal BB, and then the plugin is not caching this URL because it's just saying, okay, this URL has dynamic content. But if you think a URL should be cached, then you can just put it here, but most of them are just gonna ignore this option here. This option here just lets me to force some URLs to be publicly cached, and if you have some URLs which are privately cached or non-cacheable, then you can just force them to be publicly cached, but I'm just gonna leave this empty. And the last section is for query strings, and you have seen query strings. So whenever we have a URL and a question mark and some thing is equal to another thing, for example AA equal BB, we have a query string, and you have seen query strings in different websites. So for example, when you search in Amazon, you can see that it's appending something to the URL, and by default cache plugins do not cache any URL that contains a query string. But sometimes if you want to cache these query strings because they are not having dynamic content. So for example, if you have UTM or Google Analytics or Facebook click, and then these parameters are not showing that the page is actually dynamic, but rather they're just for marketing and for tracking users. And we can add a query string here if the content is not dynamic and we think it should be cached. Now I'm just gonna click save changes, and we are done with the cache part, and the second part is TTL. And TTL, or time to live, is just the setting for how long our caches will stay, and then after that they will die and another version of cache is just created. And the first option here is default public cache, and it's a time for public cache in seconds, and here is actually equal to 1 week. So the plugin will purge and remove the caches, the public caches, every 1 week. And we have the private cache set to 30 minutes. So if you are using caches for profile pages, then every 30 minutes it will be purged. And we have also front page, feed, and REST API, and also the time for HTTP status code, for example, for pages. And by default, all of them are just good. You don't need to change anything. And if you want to reduce the public cache, you can do it here in seconds, of course. For example, if you think that 1 week is a lot and you need a shorter lifespan for your caches, but they just seem fine to me. And you can always manually purge caches if you want. And I'm just gonna click save changes. And the next section is purge. And here we have settings for purging, and purging just means deleting a version of cache and just creating a new version. And by default, this plugin will purge any cache whenever you upgrade your theme or any plugin or the WordPress core itself. And we're just gonna leave it be on, it's just fine and okay. And the second option here is auto purge rule for publish or update. And by default, this plugin will purge some pages like front page or home page whenever you publish or update a post or page. And actually why this is doing this because your front page might link to your posts or pages. So maybe you have links in your front page and you are showing the content of your posts or pages, or maybe you are showing your latest post. And by default, these options are all good and necessary. And I think you can just uncheck monthly archive if you want, but then it's just fine and it's just harmless. And the next option here is serve state, and what it does is that it just serves an old version whenever a cache should be deleted, but the new version of the cache is not created yet. And you can just leave it on, and you might get some older content sometimes because the new cache has not been created yet, but it's just fine and it improves performance. So we're just gonna set this to be on, and we can schedule some URLs to be purged at a specific time in the day. So you can just enter some URLs here and set a time, and then the URLs will be purged automatically in that time. We don't want to touch this. And the last option here is purge all hooks. So by default, we have a list of hooks here, and a hook is just a function that just gets executed at certain times. So for example, when you switch theme, the switch theme hook will get executed. And by default, whenever you switch theme or edit a link or add a link, then the plugin will purge all of the caches, and all of these options are just fine. But if you have a new plugin and you just want to add something to it, then you can just find the appropriate hook and just paste it here. But these options are just fine. I'm just gonna save changes. And the next tab here is excludes, and here I can just exclude some URLs or strings, query strings, or categories or tags from being cached, so they will not be cached. And you can enter some URLs here, and the first two options here are really useful. So if you have a URL and it's being cached and you think that it should not be cached, maybe most of the time actually the plugin will identify that this URL shouldn't be cached. But if you think that you want to exclude some URLs from being cached, you can just enter them here, one at a line, and you should just be careful that it will match more URLs, so it doesn't look for the exact URL, and it will match similar URLs. And if you want to just specify one exact URL, you can just use the $sign at the end of the URL, or you can just use this symbol here for just marking the beginning of a URL. So you want to just say, okay, the beginning can be anything, but the end should be like this. And you can, of course, exclude some strings, some query strings here. You can just enter them, and you can exclude categories, and you can exclude tags, and also you can just exclude some cookies. And it means that if a page has these cookies, it won't be cached. You can just leave this. If you don't understand this, it's not really much useful. And also you can just exclude some user agents, some browsers. So you can just say, okay, this browser will be served by a live version and not a cached version. Of course, it's not very useful again. And also we can here exclude some rules from being cached. And of course, this option only works if you are caching private pages. If you're not, you can just not worry about these, and most of them are just okay as they are. And I'm just gonna click save. And the next option here is ESI. Now ESI, or Edge side includes, is just specific to LiteSpeed Cache plugin, and some other plugins, some other cache plugins have a similar functionality, but it's a really cool thing. And what it does is that it can serve different parts of the web page differently, i.e. it can use different time to leave or different settings for different parts. So this option allows developer to just create pages that have different parts. So maybe one part is public, maybe another part is private, and maybe you have a part that changes very frequently and you just want to purge the cache every day, but some other parts are not changing much. And by default, the options are just okay, just caching the admin bar and comment form using ESI, but developers can use its shortcodes and some settings to just benefit from it, but it's much more advanced and is coding, so we don't want to just touch these, and we can just bring the next section, which is object tab. Now here we have the setting for object cache, and the object cache is basically the cache for database queries. So it will store expensive or frequent database queries, the result of these queries. And to use the object cache, you need to have either Memcache or Redis installed on your server. And here, as you can see, I have none of these options installed, so I cannot use object cache, but you can check whether these options are installed on your server, and you can just reach your hosting provider. And they both are good, and they are very good options and very powerful. So if you have one of them enabled on your server, then you can just select the method here. Both of them, both Memcache and Redis, are very good, and you can just select them. And on some servers you might need to provide username and password, so in that case you just have to type your username and password, and the other options are just fine and okay. And also in the browser section, we can just turn the browser cache on, and I recommend that you turn it on so that the WordPress site will tell the browsers to store assets, and it's good for performance. I will just click save changes. And then in the last section, the advanced section, we have some options for HTTPS, and here we have instant click. So instant click basically makes your server load the assets and pages when people hover over a link. So when a visitor hovers over a link, then the website will start and the browser will get that link, and it can sometimes cause problems. For example, if you have lots of images or lots of visual effects with links, then it can cause problems. But in other times, it's just a really good option, and it can increase performance. And I'm just gonna set this to on, but you can just set it to off, and it's safer, of course. And in the next section, the CDN part, we can just select the CDN setting, and we can use the QUIC cloud here if you wish, and we can use any other CDN here. So if you have any other CDN, then you can just select this option, and the other options are just okay. We don't want to get to them because they're just okay. And here we have a dedicated section for Cloudflare API. So if you have Cloudflare, you can just type your email address, global API key, and domain here, and it will just connect to Cloudflare. And here we have manage, and there's nothing really here. You can just turn the development mode on if you wish, but there is really nothing here to check. And the next section is image optimization. And basically, image optimization is just compressing images so that they are smaller and your website can load faster. And all of the image optimization are done in the server, in the QUIC server, and you have a free option here. So you can buy the QUIC services, pure premium services, but they also offer a free service, and you just have to get the domain key if you want to use this image optimization, but you can use any other plugin if you wish to, but you should be aware that you should not use this setting here and with combination of another plugin, because they will interfere with each other and it can cause problems. And here is the setting. I will just set auto request cron and auto pull cron to be on, and it will just create cron jobs. It will create scheduled jobs that will optimize your images. They're just okay. And here we have the option to optimize original images, so it will change the original images, and you can just leave it on, it's okay. You can also remove original backups, but you should be aware that if you do this, if you select this option, then you have no way of getting your old images. So when an image is compressed, the quality, of course, most of the times will reduce, and then if the plugin is removing the original backups, then you have no way of restoring your original images. But I usually have my images on my hard drive and it's fine for me, but you should just make sure that you know the hazards of selecting this option. And here we can just tell the plugin to optimize images losslessly. Most of the times you don't want to check this option on, but if you have a photography website or a website that the images are very important to you and you want to have a very good quality, then you can just select optimize losslessly, and also you can just preserve the EXIF and XMP data. So they are the metadata like GPS and copyright and the camera type. And again, these two options are fairly better for photography or art websites, and in other cases you definitely want to remove the EXIF and XMP data. So in most cases you just want to remove the metadata from your images, and it's just okay to reduce the quality. And then you can just create WebP versions if you want. They are lighter, so they are much better for performance, and I will just set these two options on. But again, if you don't want, if you can just stick with JPEG, and they're just fairly good. And I will just save changes. And the next section is a page optimization. So in the previous section we were changing the setting for images, for image optimization, and then you can just optimize pages. So you can just change the, you can just minify CSS or JavaScript, and they're really important. So it's really important that you, for example, minify your CSS, then your CSS files have lower sizes because it will remove any space, and also it will remove comments, and it's generally a good idea. You can also combine CSS. Again, it's most of the time just safe and okay, and it's a good option. You can just combine external and inline CSS. Again, it's fine, and you can just HTTP to push CSS. So if you are using the HTTP 2 protocol, then you can just use the push functionality, and it will tell the browser to start downloading assets before they are required, and it's a good option. Also, you can just load CSS asynchronously. Again, it's most of the time fine and okay, and good option. But here we have generate critical CSS and use them. If you are seeing any viewer effect on your website, it might be because of this option. Then you can just turn it off. But again, most of the time it's just fine, but just be worried that this option can cause problems. And I will just save changes. And also one other option here is the font display optimization. The best setting here is swap, and it's totally okay and safe. And I will just click save changes again. The second setting here is JS setting, and again you can just minify JavaScript like the CSS. So I will just set this to on. You can just combine JavaScript, and you can just combine external and inline JavaScript, and you can just push the JavaScript. Most of them are just safe and okay, and it's okay to minify, it's okay to combine and use these options. And sometimes JS combined external and inline can cause problems. Also, maybe JS combine or JS minify, but most of the time they're just fine. If you see any weird effect, you can just change this setting later and just purge your caches. And we can just set the JS to be deferred. And also for the inline JS, also we can just select deferred. And these options are again safe and good, and they are good for performance. And I will just click save changes. The next section is optimization, and you can minify your HTML if you want to. I usually don't minify it, so I will just leave it off, but you can if you want to. And I don't touch any other options here. You can, if you want, remove WordPress emoji, and this can increase your speed because it will remove and it will not load the default emoji, and the default browser emoji will be loaded, which is just totally fine and it's good. So I will always set this off unless you're obsessed with the default emoji of WordPress. And I can just save changes again. The next setting here is media setting, and of course you can just lazy load images. So basically it will not load images until they are required. It's a standard practice in web development nowadays, and I will just leave this on. And also you can just create responsive placeholders for images. It's again fine and good. And you can just lazy load iframes, and this is a good option. I will just set this to on and save changes. And the next section here is media excludes. You can just exclude some type of media, some type of formats. Here I generally don't touch these settings, and most of the time I don't need to, so I will just skip this section. And also you have the setting for localization. Most of the time this is just okay, and the tuning section also gives you some options to exclude URLs or roles or CSS, but again these are just okay. We don't need to touch them. We don't, most of the time, don't need to exclude anything. And the next section here is database, and here you can just purge all of the caches, and you can just, for example, also purge CSS and JS, and there are some options here, totally okay. And here it can show you your auto load sizes. Here is about 200 kilobyte. You can just check this, and it shouldn't be too high, so as it will get bigger, then the performance will decrease. So 200 kilobyte is just okay. Most of the time it should be lower than 1 megabyte, and also maybe 500 kilobyte, but something less than 1 megabyte is just okay, but lower the better. And here we have the crawler option, and you can see the status of your crawler, so you can see what are they doing, and you can also manually run the crawler if you wish. And the other settings here are not anything of interest. You can just simulate crawler if you wish, and we just skip these settings because this plugin has lots of settings and you really don't need to bother about them. And finally we have the toolbox, and here we have all of your purge options, so you can purge a front page. If you change something in your front page, then you can just purge it and you can be sure that you are getting the latest changes. You can purge all pages. You can purge for free error pages, for 4 pages, 500 error pages, and you can just purge all of the cache entries by this plugin, and they are just okay. This plugin will automatically purge options because all of them will of course expire like any other cache, but when you do something and when you change something and you are not getting the result, then it's a good time to just purge that section. And you can import and export settings. So now that you have just put time and created a setting for yourself, you can just export it and then use it in another installation of WordPress and this plugin. And here we have some options for the HD access file, and you don't need to touch this. You should not touch this if you are not a developer. And we have some options here, but most of the time we don't need these options. They're just fine, and all of the settings here are just okay. We don't need to touch them. And that's it, everyone. I know this video was long, and this plugin, of course, as you saw, has lots of settings, but we touched on every important settings, everything that you need to know to make your WordPress website super fast. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. And like always, if you have any problem, you can just reach our team from the link in the caption.